Great, wonderful. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you, Mel, and thank you, Karen, and thank you, Ruth, for the introductions and for organizing, and and thank you, Holly, also. And I just want to say that I'm not at all bitter about having to sit here in Durham and not be there in person in Australia. Though I'm fairly certain we have basically the same weather, as it's quite gray here today. So today, I guess, in this lecture series, you'll be getting a lot of information about this area of northern Lebanon, from myself and some of the eminent excavator, Herman Gens. So you're very fortunate there. And that, I think there's a reason for that, in that it's one of the better known parts of Lebanon. And the way my lecture might differ a little bit from Herman's is that, I'm trying to bring together, some diverse data sets, which can really, in a Lebanese context, only be done in this sort of northern area because we have a lot of good data and a lot of excavations. But one of the things I've been trying to do for the majority of my career is understand the development of complex society in general in the Near East. And you might know that as urbanism, the first cities as they arise, or there are other words for it. We're very cautious about the words we use because in a way we don't really understand what's going on. But these discussions and a lot of the models have been dominated by a Mesopotamian sort of outlook. And the idea behind this is to pull together the data from Lebanon, because we understand that it's telling us a slightly different story about what's going on. And the Levant is telling us a different story. And within the Levant, Lebanon is telling us a different story. So there are various kind of pathways to urbanism, and Lebanon, and especially this part of northern Lebanon, is an interesting case study to sort of prove that point. So I'll be taking you through, introducing you to data sets from various places and trying to put the pieces together to sort of reconceptualize a bit, or at least provide an alternative understanding of what is happening in the first period of urbanism in the Levant and in Lebanon during what we call the early Bronze Age. Okay. And just to show you a bigger map here, just for those who may not be familiar with Lebanon, you have a coastal zone here. And this is the area we're going to be focusing on. A mountainous area, which is obviously not very well defined in this map, and then the so-called Bekaa Valley, which is a plain, a slightly more arid plain than the coast that I'll be talking about, so that we have our orientation. So in the end, we should start really, before we sort of say, what is urbanism and what is social complexity and what are all these things, we really should ask ourselves, how we go about defining a city. And I pulled together some of the criteria that we may use for defining a city, generally accepted in the knowledge of archaeology. It might be, how you would sit and define a city. And I wanted to take the settlements, sort of in Lebanon during the early Bronze Age and maybe more Levant-wide, and sort of check them against these criteria. So we know that the first cities emerge around 3050 BC, Levant-wide. That's fine. Sort of dense agglomerations here. Here you're looking at the early Bronze Age wall of Byblos, and this dates to a slightly later period within the early Bronze Age, but the wall and these sort of structures are contemporary. And the main question we want to ask, and we've been asking for a long time, is how and why does this occur? And we have some ideas. Your very own V. Gordon Child, I think, really set the framework there. I'll talk about that in a second. But I would say that while we are very good in the Levant and in the Near East at describing the physical elements of infrastructure, and descriptive archaeology is often seen as a kind of negative, but here, I mean, we really have a good idea about what's going on what's going on when, and we really understand it very well. So we know what buildings are there. We know, when they occur and how they change with time. And we know that really well across the Levant. And we're starting to know that at least in this part of Lebanon. But I would say that an understanding of actually what goes on at these sites, a really in-depth understanding, really evades. And oftentimes we're making assumptions, again, based on what we understand from, either a Mesopotamian model or understanding of civic life in later cities. So, we have buildings, but do they function as temples or domestic structures? That's probably the extent of the knowledge we have, but even there, the lines are quite blurred. Are there marketplaces? What other activities that we associate with civic life really go on in these places? And again, it's really difficult to know, what goes on in these settlements. So I would say that the key elements of, identity and ritual and economic activity and sort of the way in which political hierarchies are structured should be re-examined in light of new data. I will say that, we're not going to have a paradigm shift based on what we know from Lebanon because there's just not much there. But I think looking at what's there, we can at least posit some different kind of potential interpretations. The one thing I will say is throughout the Levant, there is a kind of shared physical infrastructure. So basically, the buildings look pretty similar. You get the same types of buildings. You get city walls around settlements. There's some shared material culture, basic similarities in pottery or something. And this kind of implies a development, and there's a developmental unity, that's true. And this kind of implies a sort of sociological unity or a unity with later, a sociological unity, and perhaps a unity with our later notions of civic life, because a lot of the elements of infrastructure are things we would find in medieval cities. So we might say, well, these places probably functioned like medieval cities. But the question is, can we impose that understanding of our sort of later understanding of cities on this period or not? And we could ask the question, are terms like urbanism and city really useful in this context? What is the city? And, how do we define it? So what are the key elements as we probably understand them? And I might be missing one or two here. In looking at the data, we'll talk Levant-wide. Again, do we have settlement hierarchies? So are there sites that are smaller and bigger? And so that's yes, so that does imply that some sites are maybe dominant over others, or that there are more important sites and less important sites. Do we have dense planned settlements with, public infrastructure? Yes. So that's definitely the case, though the size varies throughout the Levant. And I'm going to be pointing out that the sites in Lebanon are much smaller than they are further to the south in what is Palestine today. And, we have, of course, public architecture here. You can see the city wall here is a big public architecture. And then we have various elements that are like that as well. We understand our cities today is functioning as economic hubs, and a lot of times that's how they're interpreted within this period. But actually, I would argue that there is not necessarily very clear evidence of that. And there's limited evidence, for example, of markets. And actually, for the early Bronze Age, there's limited evidence that the cities themselves or these settlements focus as places of craft production. So there are a lot of craft products and they're being produced, but we don't really have clear evidence that they're being produced in the settlements themselves. I mean, it exists in some places, but I wouldn't say it's widespread. Whereas in later periods, you do have that evidence there, so you find things like kilns and evidence of metalworking or something. But again, it evades mostly in these sites. There's some evidence of agricultural processing and storage. Actually, there's a lot of evidence of that. It seems to be the main thing that the early Bronze Age settlements in Lebanon do. International connections for this period, especially compared to later ones, are limited. So again, if we're thinking about these places as core economic hubs, I would say that connections, especially connections with Egypt, much is made out of them, and especially with this site, Byblos here. But outside of that, there's very limited evidence of connections. Whereas in later periods, you have much more evidence of that. So what about political hubs? What are these settlements like? Again, in later periods, you have clear evidence of kingship. In the Middle Bronze Age, there are kings that there's historically attested. There's there are big palaces, there are royal burials. But in the early Bronze Age, we just don't have any real evidence of that. And there's no real significant evidence for social differentiation, although I think as we move through the period, we're going to start to see the elements of that. And some of the evidence I'll present is a sort of increasing, evidence of social differentiation. But it's not as clear cut as it is for later periods. I think we would all agree. Cities and settlements are great centers of ritual performance and communal activity. And of course, we have that evidence. Okay. Cultic objects are not common, but we do have things we can define as temples throughout the Levant and in this part of Lebanon. And, even these large civic structures are evidence that, the place is a hub for the wider communal activity. I mean, these settlements are so small, I'll talk about that in a second, that they can't possibly be capturing the entire population. So it's not that the entire population of the region lives there. So it's clear that they are drawing people there, at least for the purpose of large-scale building projects. So, looking at these, how do these spaces align with our notions of civic life and the wider social and geographical context? And you'll see, not perfectly, is the question. And we'll be discussing that in a bit more detail. And then my point is, especially thinking about the way we study the Levant, has the imposition of these concepts, really hindered our understanding? I mean, do we need a refreshed theoretical framework where we take some of what we already have, where there's stuff with good evidence, and then sort of rethink it with a fresh outlook? Okay. So how and why does, again, this is a lot of this is based on V. Gordon Childe. Well, a lot of what we had previously thought. And that's not to say that work isn't important. So how and why does administrative complexity develop in the Lebanese context is something we'll be exploring today by looking at this one area. And then, we've often thought of this as a long-term process of social and technological innovation leading to population growth, and then the need for administrative complexities. That's the general idea, and that comes from Childe. So you got the Neolithic, people are settled, they're farming, and they've invented pottery that makes their lives a lot easier. And eventually the population is growing, and they need to develop into cities essentially because there's a need for administrative complexity. But as you'll see, the kind of idea of the early Bronze Age sort of just, especially in the Lebanese context, just appears one day. It's really not there, it seems, in 3200 BC or 3100 BC, and then it is there in 3050 BC. And so it's a completely different thing. And so, I mean, while you do have developmental phases in other parts of the Levant and in other parts of the Near East, it doesn't exist here. So this idea of urbanism and the urban package just shows up already kind of fully formed. So it sort of casts into doubt this point of a longer term process of social and technological innovation, though at the same time, and we can see a general tendency, though it's a bit up and down, for there to be kind of more and more settlement and greater population with time, starting from the Neolithic. Okay, just already made this point here. It argues against the long-term developmental process. The Bekaa Valley on the interior is a little bit more difficult to gauge. Again, I want to make a differentiation that this is coastal Lebanon is very different than what goes on in other parts of the Levant, even placed 50 kilometers away in the valley. I surveyed this material for my dissertation, and I have to say, the material is a bit more like Palestine, but until we get clear excavations there, we're not really going to know, what's happening. And hopefully those are ongoing now. So the main thing about the Levant and thinking about it and in this area is that the social conditions underpinning urbanism, settlement nucleation, I'm kind of moving away from this term. We use 6 terms to say the same thing, so because we're afraid to actually use one term over the other, are often variable and can only be seen as such. So developmental trajectories in a particular area need to be taken on their own. And you're going to see here that there's no sort of one-size-fits-all explanation for understanding why these kind of monumentalized places develop or occur as they do throughout the Near East. And actually, it's worth taking every area and really examining the data. And I might go as far to say is that the sort of Mesopotamian model doesn't even really fit with Egypt, where in this period you don't have what we would call huge cities. And then the Mesopotamian area where you have these big cities that really function like we would think they do and probably have the notions of civic life that I discussed, that's maybe more seen as an aberration rather than the norm within the Near Eastern or the Middle Eastern or the Southwest Asian context. Okay, why is Lebanon an interesting case study and why is it different? Herman has the pleasure of sitting in Lebanon now, and I'm sure very much enjoying what is a very beautiful country. The environment is mountainous and it's wooded, and even though the Levant is mountainous, generally speaking, Lebanon is quite special and it's extremely well watered. I mean, you have springs everywhere. And the main thing here is, like the rest of the Levant, you have really multiple strategies. It's not a desert environment where you can only do one or two things. It really provides you with a range of ways to sort of subsist. And I love, thinking about this little homestead, here on this little terrace. And, you can just find a spring and, an area of flat land and, go about your business, growing your crops. You're going to get enough rain probably to grow most things that you need. And thinking about that in the context of the early Bronze Age, this might explain why Lebanon has such small settlements. Actually, people don't necessarily need to live near elements of physical infrastructure that make their lives that are necessary to their lives, like irrigation canals or things like that. They can disperse throughout the hills. And in a way, you can see it as being a bit more, they might be a little bit less connected to settlements. They have a bit more freedom to just sort of walk off into the mountains and do something else if they don't like what's going on politically. And there's great variation across the country. I mean, some areas, in the Bekaa Valley, if you go to the north, are very arid. The areas of northern Lebanon are more well-watered than the south, but generally speaking, multiple subsistence strategies are, possible. So again, there are similar developmental phases for the early Bronze Age to, and I'll talk about those in a second, to Palestine. Generally speaking, on the surface, they're pretty similar. And this period sees a great expansion of settlement. But again, the settlements are very small. Now, here is Hermann Genz's site of Farus, and here's a map of what it looked like in the 1960s. And again, this settlement is, maybe 2 hectares at a stretch. I think maybe it's between 1 and 1.5. And, it still has, even though it's a tiny site, it still has a massive, meters thick. I don't remember exactly. Maybe 6, maybe more, a meters thick fortification wall surrounding it. So it doesn't matter. Just like a 15-hectare site in Palestine would have. And then I just superimpose this over my neighborhood in England. It might not make much sense to you guys, but just to show that this place is tiny. How many people could possibly live there, even if it was full? Most models would say you're looking at 100 at a stretch, something like that. And then what about that? What impact does that have on civic life or anonymity? If you wanted something from someone, you could pretty much yell at them, across the site. There's no anonymity there. And even some of the bigger sites like Byblos, which are 4 or 5 hectares, it's not a huge amount of people. So again, there's a question there about whether you can really envisage this as an urban space. And then, some anthropologists would say with such a small scale society, organization isn't really totally necessary in this way. So there might be other things that are driving the move towards building these spaces. Again, Palestine is much bigger. You get huge sites there, 30-hectare sites. We have those in Lebanon in certain places in the Bekaa, but they're mostly, because they're large Roman settlements as well. I doubt they're early Bronze Age. And the average size of site in Palestine is 4 to 12 hectares. So even though it's not that far to the south, you can see that it is very different. In Lebanon, the level of knowledge is varied. The settlement landscape of the Bekaa, here's from Marfo's survey. We have, different sites of different sizes, and we know what the settlement hierarchy looks like there because it's a flat plain. So traditional excavation works. But we don't have really any excavations there. So we don't know the different phasing and things. And it may well be very different than what we find on the coast of northern Lebanon. The coast is less well known, though the reason we study the area we're studying is because we have a good indication. And it's because surveying there is much more difficult. There's a lot more urbanism. And then what's the real unknown here is the mountains, because they're difficult to survey. We have a number of survey teams moving through, and I think Herman is involved in one of those, but it's just very difficult. It's very forested, and in our traditional Near Eastern survey techniques just don't really work. So because of that, we're going to focus on this area that's especially well known, but does form a kind of tight cluster. It sort of, how can I say this? It sort of has its own thing going on, I guess, is what I would say. Different to what we have sites in the south, like Sidon, and sites just to the north in Arco, which seem to be the center of their own kind of intensive interaction areas. So when we think about Lebanon in general, or what we call the Central Levant, the developments there are broadly in line with a core zone of distinctive material culture, mostly underpinned by the pottery. You can call it metallic ware, and later on they'll call it coned ware. But you have these sort of jars of various shapes. They differ sort of superficially, in size, but the general idea, the pottery repertoire looks the same in terms of what sort of forms are there, and how it looks. So basically, you've got this area highlighted in gray, which more or less covers this zone. So the Byblos region differs from the other parts of Lebanon, and other parts of the Levant as well, in the sense that they tend to build in stone. We're rethinking this a bit. It might be that they build mostly in stone and then maybe have some small mud brick superstructure, but we have massive stone walls. Wait till you see the images of Herman's site. You're gonna be blown away that there are 2-3 meter walls, stone walls preserved, and we have the same at Kubba. A little bit smaller, but the point is these are mostly stone. Whereas in other cases, you have a stone foundation and then largely a mud brick superstructure. So thinking about Lebanon in general, here is a building, the large building from Herman's site of Farus. And one of the, you can see how this looks. One of the weird things about Lebanon is they love these kind of column bases and jamming them in corners in various places. You find this at Byblos, you find this at Kubba, and you find this at Arka, and you find it in the Bekaa Valley, and you find it at Sidon. So they love these column bases. Presumably these held wooden pillars that were who knows, maybe special wood or something like that. But you can see there are quite a lot of them. I mean, they seem to have some architectural purpose. You have evidence of that from Farouz, especially, but like in general, there's probably more columns than you would need to hold up a roof, or hold up a building. So they're probably partially decorative as well. Here is a building from a site called Tel Arqa, and you can see you have a kind of foundation structure, which is made of stone, 5 or 6 courses, and then a mud brick top. The buildings seem to be entered from the top, and it seems to be the case anyway. Like we rarely find entrances or things like that. But again, the Byblos region tends to build in stone, and please forgive the medieval castle here, but these are all early Bronze Age buildings, and you can see that the walls are substantial, and they're preserved to a substantial height usually. And here are the lovely these buttresses, which will also become quite important. I'm sorry, just checking the chat here. I noticed one came in. Okay. So again, I've discussed that there are some peculiarities in the ceramic material and in the architecture that sort of that sort of define this region. So I'm going to do my best at phasing here, and actually, it's quite tricky to do. We have really good evidence, and in the last, let's say, from studying the work of Herman at Farouz and the work of the late Jean-Paul Tellman at Arqa, we've been able to kind of parse out the early Bronze Age into roughly 100-year blocks. Well, the early Bronze Age 2 and 3, actually. I realized the early Bronze Age 4 is like 500 years, but it seems like it's an afterthought of the early Bronze Age, but actually it's the main period, really, if you think about it in terms of time. But we've been roughly able to parse them out, and there's some now better radiocarbon date evidence for this. So for example, this date comes from radiocarbon date from Kobo, which represents the very earliest early Bronze Age, and it matches what we find at other sites as well. So we have an EB2 phase, which is relatively short-lived. Oh, sorry, we start with the Chalco EB. So this is an enigmatic period, to say the least. It's mostly represented by burials in the region we're talking about. There's very little architecture. There's some architecture at Byblos, though it's very scattered. The majority of the evidence comes from burials. There's evidence further to the south. They have these kind of apsidal buildings, which fit a kind of EB1B in Palestine, 3,700, something like that. There is evidence, I think, even at Farouz, of a sort of gap after 3,500 BC. Although I have to say at Byblos, there's probably occupation all the way up. I'll present the data there later. And then, out of nowhere, this kind of early Bronze Age stuff, this just shows up. You get it occurring at many sites. I don't think they have the earliest phase at Farouz, but we have it at Arqa and Byblos. Most of the major sites, the ones that are big ones, are occupied. Even Kubba, it's divided into 2 sites. Kubba 2 doesn't have this period, but we have a small scale excavate option there at Kubba 1. So it's defined by this distinctive shale pottery. It's very unusual, and kind of jar forms, various different types that just didn't occur in the period before. Relatively small scale building, at all sites. And I want to say that there are no fortifications dating to this period, but there is some indication that one could exist at Byblos during this period. I had to update the presentation to take into account new data. And then we have the EB23, which is consistent with a wider building program, starting at about 2,900. You get this kind of these kind of sealant pressures. This one's from Arqa. I'm showing it mostly because it's a lovely jar. But there is a lot of this shale pottery, and then we're starting to get an influx of more locally made, calcareous pottery. I'll talk about the pottery a little bit more later. As I'm a pottery specialist, you really weren't going to get out of here without hearing a lot about it, actually. And then we have the EB3, which is, the main period of building activity. When you look at a site for this period, whether it's Byblos or Farouz or Kubba, the main area of occupation really starts around 2,800. And that's because they built these enormous buildings with huge foundations. And there's a massive building program at all sites. And this is kind of a key point, in that all of these phases and what's going on there seem to be mirrored at most of the sites in the region, at least in the Byblos, Farouz, Kubba kind of triangle. We have them at all sites, and it seems like the same thing is kind of going on. So when you have a certain type of architecture at Byblos, like they build with these large foundations in this period, actually it's called the period of the large foundations, you find it at Farouz and you find it at Kubba. So it's like, there are large scale events of building activity that are punctuated by minor, internal walls being fixed or stuff. But basically, you've got two phases where all the building at all the sites seems to be done at one time, maybe within a period of 40 years or something like that. I mean, that's the best we can tell, but it seems to be the case. Huge fortifications are built, and this shale pottery goes away. And it's quite important for reasons I'll discuss later, but they're now using local fabrics, and the pottery repertoire is changing a bit. But most of the vessels are there, to hold olive oil and all sorts of, and to feed into that system. And then in the last period, we get a reworking of sites with larger buildings and more open plans, which tends to happen at all sites. I want to say that the phasing is a little bit difficult because you have this kind of shelf in the radiocarbon calibration curve. So where we have, any olive pit dating to this period, you'll basically get a date that says, 850 to 2600 or something like that. But at Herman's site, they've done a lot of statistical analysis that allows us to kind of parse this out. And the material and the phasing gives us an indication. So we can have a good guess at these various phases. Okay. But the question is, again, what actually goes on at these places? We really don't know. I mean, so we're going to broadly understand that this is kind of, as Herman and myself have interpreted, as a domestic building. But, there's domestic activities going on there, but, what is the actual, how would it look if it were a ritual building? I mean, are the lines blurred? Is it reasonable to say that this building is purely domestic or it's ritual, or do they have different sort of cross-cutting functions? So we'll attempt to piece the evidence together to answer. So I'll talk about all these phases in turn that I've just described. Here, we'll start our journey in the Chalcolithic EB1 and talk about the important point here that all of the early Bronze Age sites that we know of in this area, they show some evidence of occupation in the Chalcolithic. And so it's important to say that the location of these sites is kind of independent of the concerns of the early Bronze Age. You'll get a lot of commentators talking about the positioning of sites, saying, they're taking advantage of economic opportunities that are afforded by new trunk roads and all sorts of things. And there's a great ramp up of the economy, which is true in the early Bronze Age. But actually, I would argue that, the position of these sites, they were deemed important and sacred, probably there's evidence for that well before, the early Bronze Age. So the locations are kind of fixed in a certain way by the time we get to the early Bronze Age. So the locations of sites are usually, it's a bit of subjectivity on my part, admittedly, but next to usually unique features on the coast. So it could be that there really is a sort of more of a ritual association that then develops into what we think of as the early Bronze Age. I just want to show really quickly here is Kubba, the beautiful view from there. It sits on a spur. Everyone who knows Kubba knows that behind it are this wall of kind of caves, which is an unusual feature on the Lebanese coast. So it's been the focus of activity there since the Neolithic, and probably people were drawn to these caves for various reasons. Probably other things as well. It's good springs around. It's a place where you can make a life quite easily. But again, this seems to be one of the reasons it's occupied. Here's the sea coast in front of Farus. Farus, I really struggle to find a symbolic structure there, but there are underwater springs abound, and it's unusual. They just kind of, when you're swimming in the water there, they kind of hit you, so you can actually get fresh water out of this. So there is something there that makes it at least unusual. Here is the site of Enfe, and again, there's a small early Bronze Age site here, but everyone will know this place. Who knows Lebanon will know that this is a kind of unusual rock outcrop in the context of the Lebanese coast. Just moving this here. I'm just going to close this. Okay. So for the Chalcolithic EB1, Byblos is the key site. It's mostly represented by burials. There are some dwellings of an unclear relationship, but all these gray dots here are burials. 2,000 of these kind of burials, men, women, and children were found at the site and buried with distinctive grave goods. Here you can see a mace head, a lump of metal. The settlement pattern is totally unclear in its relationship in terms of its stratigraphy. I have to say Byblos is a well-known disaster of an excavation. Very, very difficult to wrap your head around what's going around on the site. But this is more in the spirit of kind of ritual economies that were common in the Chalcolithic across the Levant. So, this is a place where you work very hard to get material, and then you basically, show your devotion to individuals by I mean, essentially disposing of this material in a probably in a very public ceremony. And it's kind of there's a lot of exotica that's being brought through, and there's evidence of good trade links. So you have metals coming from Egypt, you have stuff coming from Anatolia, which in a way, isn't that much in evidence in the urban period. So we've got much greater trade links and much evidence of a wider trade network during this time. Just to show you what the pottery looks like very briefly, it's locally made, dates uncertain after 3500 BC. But I'll show you this because it'll contrast to the material you're going to see. And then it's clear we should say that the EB2 material is a complete break with what was there before. It's totally different. Okay. Let's go back here. Sorry, I forgot to show you the site of Byblos here. What makes Byblos special and it's unique is that it has a sacred spring somewhere in the center. I think it's somewhere around here. The burials are sort of surrounding this sacred spring, which will always be a focal point for ritual activity at the site. And one of the reasons I think it was so important. Okay. Just to go through these phases, I've already just sort of discussed this. The principal sites are occupied. Here is, a plan of Byblos. Again, you've got kind of a lot of various temples and, buildings of uncertain interpretation, probably like sort of temple complexes or something. We have evidence of Kubwa 1, which is on the coast, the two sites of Kubwa. That's where Mel worked in the first year, and we found this material together, actually. So thank you, Mel, for organizing all that material in the first instance. But there we got lucky because we have only pits. We're not lucky because of that. We don't have any settlement. I don't think one is going to emerge, but we have pits containing only this very, very early pottery confirmed by radiocarbon dates. So it shows us the very earliest material that matches up with other sites in the region and is kind of confirmed what this material would look like. Okay, I just wanted to show you, though, that I've said at Byblos that this kind of early Bronze Age 2, kind of comes out of nowhere, and that we're not really sure what's going on at these Chalcolithic sites at 3100 BC. But actually, don't worry about reading any of this information. I'll just tell you what it says. That essentially, this site, even though it was really a disaster in terms of excavation, I mean, we got to believe the excavator when he says that actually in a certain place he found various EB2 assemblages, so early Bronze Age 2 assemblages, side by side with earlier Chalcolithic material. And so it shows that there is kind of a transitional phase, or at least that these people are kind of working together. And again, this is just a quote from an earlier presentation, but it just says that that's going on in a lot of places where you have these sort of earlier villages, and then it seems that they're continuing for a short time simultaneously as the old system comes into place. But the reason I bring this up is it's possible that whatever underlying structures are there, in terms of the socio-political element that would develop in the EB2-3 system, they are already in place, but that the EB2 kind of ceramic hardware and new styles of building is a new way of managing those structures, and especially in terms of ramping up communal agriculture and then also intensifying them. So we have that. Okay. In the EB2-3, there's a major expansion of settlement. I've been walking around Lebanon for a while, and I have to say, you do find this pottery at a lot of sites throughout the country. So it's a very extensively documented period. There are a few walls at Farus. Herman can correct me there, no problem, dating to this kind of transitional time. And there is a shift in settlement to the Kubwa 2, which is the main site that we're working at there. But the change in the pottery technology allows us to cautiously date this phase. I'll talk about that later, but you get a different type of fabric that occurs, and that lets us, along with a different style of pottery. And you get these kind of seal impress sherds, and they're made of this very special and unique fabric. So this helps us. But these are then absent in the early Bronze Age 3, and the pottery repertoire, though it's kind of similar types, there are things that drop out. And then, the pottery repertoire really changes and becomes quite distinct. And I'll talk about that later. Then when we talk about the EB3, there's major building at all sorts of places. So this early phase at Farus, big fortification wall, all these buildings here, which is one I had the pleasure of excavating under the guidance of and direction of Herman Gens. Again, he has, we have sort of defined these as domestic settlements because obvious you find obvious why you find a grinding stone here, you find an oven in the corner which you can't see, and you find sort of bones scattered everywhere and these whole pottery vessels. But I do sort of question some of the nature of the final deposits here, because in the end I remember finding, like, I don't know, 8 or 9 like goat horn cores in this assemblage. I had to confirm with the zooarchaeologist again. So it is kind of domestic, but it's quite unusual. So this building was later filled in, and I wonder if this is a kind of a ritual deposit, in order to kind of sanctify the building or something before they built on top of it. Again, you have this isn't a great picture of the fortification wall, but it's kind of this monumental staircase that presumably led up to the fortification wall. I mean, I don't know that we can say that for sure, but I'll let Herman comment on that. But again, you can see the scale of the building. I mean, it's about defense, but it's also about flash. The walls are huge, and people who work on sort of warfare of the period would say that you would never need a fortification wall that's 6 meters thick or even bigger surrounding a settlement. There's just no weapon that it really is built to protect. So it's worth seeing these things as elements, as being built for their own sake. A sort of attempt at monumentality to draw communities together, to sort of mimic what we're seeing in other parts of the Near East. I mean, it's possible around 2900 BC, these people would have been to Uruk and seen the city wall there. We've got to really think about how you conceptualize making a place, what we call placemaking. How do people really build cities? If I were to say to you, for example, oh, let's build a religious structure, you draw in all sorts of elements from what you've seen in your life. But actually, when we want to build a sacred or a space, like, what concepts are they really drawing on? And I would argue that floating around the Near East are a kind of palette of options that people are choosing from, but that the underlying sociological reasons for doing them differ from place to place. But basically, this explains why we have shared infrastructure throughout the area, and why it shows up everywhere, but that actually we see the underlying social structures might be very different from place to place, and the underpinnings of the economy are different from place to place. Okay. Here is the same phase at Kuba. And you can see here we have this very, very long wall, and you have these buttressed features. Now I'll show you a close-up picture of this. This wall is buttressed is made with ashlars. It's a very lovely wall. This seems to be enclosing something. There's a large sort of rocky outcrop here, and we struggled with this for a bit, but you kind of come into this area, and these walls are chiseled out so you can proceed. And earlier on, I would say that when we first started excavating this, my colleague and co-director, Graham Phillip, sort of said, this is funny. It might be like the Temple of the Rock that they find in Ebla or something. I thought he was absolutely crazy when he said this, But actually, this large rocky feature, which is a huge thing, it seems to be, now that we've excavated this big, I mean, this wall is not, 20 meters long. It seems to basically work to enclose this kind of rock, which may have been sacred. And the reason we have an inkling that this might be sacred architecture is, generally speaking, at Byblos, where we have sacred architecture, we tend to find buttresses. This is the L-shaped temple at Byblos, and you can see the enclosure wall is surrounded by buttresses. They also occur on elements of civic architecture as well, so city walls tend to have them. Within this structure, we had large amounts of midden deposits, and there were plenty of those there. And there's a lot of restorable pottery, and it's hard for us to say whether or not these were deposited, later on, or just general dumps, or whether they're there as part of kind of the activity of what's going on there. Just want to show you a few more pictures of Kubba. I don't want to take away too much time. I think maybe running a bit behind. And here is a picture of what the wall looks like up close, and you can see this absolutely huge monumental architecture, and this big rock in the back, which the wall was made, to move around this rock. Like, they could have easily removed it, but they clearly chose not to. It's sort of incorporated there. And here you can see a slightly better picture of it. Later on, in a later phase, this wall is kind of rebuilt. It's sort of, this enclosure is made smaller. This rock still exists, but it's very much surface. Only this part exists, and there are some buildings built here, which I'll talk about in a second. But right here, in the kind of cornerstone or the capstone, we found this. And this is, I'm told, a copper adze. I would have called it an axe, but it's an adze for shaping wood. And you've really got to understand how rare metalwork is in this period. You know, we have a handful of lumps of stuff from Farouz. Byblos has some elements, but Levant wide, you know, you don't really find metalwork that commonly. You know, there are tens of examples of these axes to be sure, you know, coming through, but not hundreds, you know, really. So this is a really special thing. There's no copper anywhere in Lebanon. There's, you know, they have to import all of it. So to take something like this out of circulation would have been a big deal. It's clear they've deposited it very carefully as a kind of ritual act. It sort of also speaks to the fact that the building is probably very important, and even reimagining it or reworking it had to be done with a great amount of care. You know, we find very rare metal axes because I think they needed them. They just melted them down and reused them. So I wanted to show you in a later phase at Kubba, we find they used this wall to build these buildings here, where you have kind of these unusual circular, semicircular floors, and dividing walls and channels, sort of combining them here. I'll show you what they look like in this picture. Here's the old wall. And then, you know, channels. And in this room, we found 4, and even over here, a 5th vat. And this room is kind of partially destroyed by later building activity. So there may have even been more. And just to show you what these vats look like, here is Hashim, who has kindly restored this vat for us. And he's not a small person, you know, he's 6'2". So these things are absolutely enormous. And we find sherds of them all over in this, not only at Kubba, but at sites like Farus. So they're very large. And they're more than you would need for domestic activity, that's for sure. And our best guess is that these are olive processing vats. And you know, there are ways and I've seen videos of this where instead of pressing olives, you sort of crush them and then you let them in hot water, and then you know, and then you can skim the oil that rises from the top. And they still do this today in Syria. And you know, there's a way of managing oil. So they, you know, during this, it's clear that they are making and storing large amounts of oil. And the thing about Kuba that's kind of important, and I'll only just gloss over here, is that you have this attached to the temple. We're still trying to understand, you know, how these places are organized sociopolitically. And it seems that we'll point out that temples are growing in importance, and they're gaining little by little more political authority. And eventually they probably will develop into palaces, and in, you know, the important priests and families will develop into the kings. But here we have direct evidence that the temple is involved in this sort of communal system of agriculture that seems to underpin a lot of activity at these sites, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. We also had uniquely at Kuba a lower area. You know, we did some geophysical work, and we did some geophysical work, and we had a bunch of pottery off Tell, and we found some evidence of some architecture. A lot of this turns out to be nothing, but actually we did manage to find this large building, and it comes into a corner here. We have no idea what it's for because we only got to excavate a small part of it, but it is quite substantial. It dates to the last phase of the EB3. And down here, we only find, you know, jars and vats and sort of like the more of the processing side of things. So we think, and it's one of the first off-tell kind of settlements for the early Bronze Age in Lebanon, or really for a lot of the Bronze Age. And we think that this is mainly a sort of industrial area where they're processing olives, things like that. Here is the ceramic repertoire from that area. As you can see, just many jars. These are big comeware jars that can be, you know, up to 80 centimeters in height, something like that. And you know, you have a lot of these vats, a few cooking pots and things. In this other phase at Farus, you've got a reorientation of sites. So the earlier buildings I showed you, you can see them here. They're completely filled in, and new larger buildings are built. And this is a common theme, you know, throughout the early Bronze Age 3. As it ramps up, you're getting spaces reorganized and larger buildings built. And here you have evidence of administrative activity. These are 2-cylinder seals. I think they're made of ivory, maybe hippopotamus ivory. Herman, you correct me if I'm wrong, but you can see one of them's unfinished. So they're clearly, this building has administrative character, you know, very clearly. No one knows what these seals are for. They're not using them on pottery, so who knows? But probably to mark out sort of you know, official you know, jars or stocks or things like that, or rooms. And you know, even though you still have, you know, a sort of mortar and pestle in here, again, these buildings are probably multi-function. But it shows that the administrative complexity is getting greater with time, and you know, perhaps more oppressive. At Byblos, this is what the EB3 looks like. You can see the massive city wall I showed you in a picture earlier. And I want to draw your attention to these various structures, which are all temples. I want to point out that this is a lot of the site. Like, the excavator kind of did it very old school and kind of just dug the whole site. But the majority of what's there for any period really at the site is early Bronze Age. That is the phase that dominates Byblos. Very famous site, but actually this phase of the EB3 is the majority of what you find at the site. And I want to point out actually that it's mostly temples and associated buildings. There's not that much that doesn't seem to be associated with a nearby temple. I mean, of course, there may be domestic structures here and there, but every area has a temple. And actually, my colleague Michel de Vries and this was mostly his idea. He sort of was able by looking at city streets, and it was also proposed by the excavator that these discrete areas could be divided into neighborhoods based around particular temples. So there are two temples that are kind of important and the most important, and we'll talk about because they have the most evidence for Egyptian activity. And that's the Balit Gebel temple here, and this sort of the sacred, the Ancient Sacré, the temple of the sacred well. And also later on, the L-shaped temple will become important. Talk about this again a little bit later. So what does the economy look like in these places? Well, the entire area, and this is from Farouz, is dominated by a high proportion of olive oil production. Some grape, but in emmer wheat, also, but really the olives are everywhere. If you've ever excavated at one of these sites, you can just dig up olive pits, with your trowel. The olives are everywhere. I mean, they really seem to be the main purpose there is something to do with olive production. And all this evidence is echoed at Kubba. We have the same profile as Farouz really. And then Yarmout, which is a site in the southern Levant, but is quite similar in a sense, also is one of the few places where you get this high proportion of olives. But then you see there are other areas that are dominated by emmer wheat and other things like barley. So this really is a unique agricultural profile. Sheep, goat, and cattle seem to be kept at sites. Again, Kubba, the data from Kubba and Farouz seem to be saying the same thing. They're managed by inhabitants. However, there's some evidence, as far as I understand it, of provisioning. We haven't gotten there yet at Kubba, but Farouz seems to show that. Like, you got a lot of old animals. There's a lot of wool being produced, but basically some of the meat weight animals are clearly being sent away, probably to the more important. I mean, the idea being maybe they're provisioning certain sites or temples at sites that are more important. We have a huge amount of ceramic jars, and these are probably made to feed or manage this system of agriculture that I was talking about. The jars are there to store liquid goods, basically, and they need to be there. But overall, durable prestige objects are quite rare. We have these bone cosmetic designers that show up at various sites. I just show them here because there seems to be a few at various sites. I wanted to, this is from Farouz, one of the latest publications on the site. And you have these carnelian beads. And again, they're a mixture of sort of the later EB3 phases. A lot of these some of these dates in the Middle Bronze Age and the Early Bronze Age. And you also have various exotic beads in stone. But broadly speaking, the main thing to say there is it's a relatively insular economy. And there's no real evidence for a market economy. And there's not much in terms of international connections. There is some evidence for a contact with Egypt. We get stone bowls at Byblos. We have one at Farouz and one potential piece of a glyph or something. But again, any sort of outside contact doesn't seem to be making its way to other sites in the area, which it does in later periods in the Middle Bronze Age, etc. Okay, let's go through the ceramics. I just want to be clear here that the ceramics here are important because we think that the majority of what these places are doing are acting as kind of hubs for the communal production and processing of agricultural goods, mainly olives. So in a way, if that's the temple is its main role is religious, and then to manage that, you can imagine that these ceramics are absolutely critical. We've sort of called them the hardware of early states, and they're critical to the maintenance and production of liquid products. But in other ways, they carry a clearly identifiable brand. They look very distinct. They're often combed in this kind of very funny way. This is an example from Egypt. And they make their way to Egypt, and they're very important there. And people they're like the wine bottles of their day. You sort of know what you're looking at when you're looking at it, and that it contains an important product. Okay. So I want to just start by saying earlier on, there's this distinctive fabric, and it's found in this area here. I'll just show you what this looks like petrographically. This is kind of what I do. It comes in sort of two stripes, but you can see that, nothing like it existed before and nothing like it exists after. And the thing with these shale sources is they're found quite high in the mountains. So we really have to struggle to understand how this pottery is being distributed. But almost all the early pottery is made of this fabric. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And eventually, in later periods, it gets this kind of specialized fabric with this silty kind of shale in it. And that's what's used to make the very finest jars. But my colleague Graham Philp and I have posited this theory that actually this is being done by itinerant potters. Maybe they're part-time specialists. They go into the mountains, they're bringing down dried clays, and they're potting to order at various sites. And just to show you, we have this sort of chemical data, which shows this is the kind of special wear I was just talking about. You have samples from the Bekaa Valley, the Jordan Valley, the Lebanese coast, and northern Jordan, and all of these are found to have the same chemistry. So we're not suggesting that they're produced in the same place, but they're produced using very similar sources. So the interesting thing is that around the EB3, the repertoire changes, the combing changes, but importantly, there's a move towards limestone fabrics, which reflect local sources. They're no longer relying on people bringing material in from the mountains. And this coincides with the major building phases of the EB3. So the idea is, because the economy and the agriculture is ramping up, they need more pottery. And because that, they need to ensure a supply by maintaining specialists locally. And they've sort of rejigged the technology in ways in order to be able to use liquid materials in a way they hadn't been able to do before. So there's evidence of centralized production and the local capture of ceramic production. And this just reiterates the point that I made earlier. Just to show you what the repertoire looks like, there are some kind of local drinking vessels still made out of shale, and there's some evidence of a move away. Earlier, I showed these platter bowls, which are evidence of sort of communal feasting. These go out of the repertoire in Lebanon. They stay in Palestine, but in the end, it's interesting. They seem to be moving towards a more, let's say, liquid culture, which may or may not involve alcohol. But then in the early Bronze Age 3, you really get, again, I've showed you this, a repertoire that has a lot of jars. And here are some pictures again from Farouz, showing what these things look like in person, just so you can get a sense. I mean, this is a huge vessel that they found. That's a pithos, a storage jar that's a meter wide. I want to say that a lot of these jars, like this medium one here, I mean, they're the first sort of transport amphorae that really exist, and they're the first sort of ocean-going vessels because they make their way over to Egypt. And what this graph shows you is that we've done chemical analysis, and where these dots are closer together, the chemistry is closer together. So you can see we have samples from Farouz, we have samples from Kubba. These are the calcareous EB3 wares. We have samples from Byblos. And these are kind of linked, they're showing a very similar chemistry. But if you go further north, where you have petrographically and sort of functionally indistinct vessels, the chemistry says a different picture. So these represent different kind of organizations of production. What it tells us is that the site to the north that I showed you, Tel Arqa, sort of has a different interaction sphere, whereas the Byblos area, the sites we're talking about, the jars are traded between each other quite frequently, probably because they represent a shared production. Whereas jars from Arca don't really seem to be coming in this area. And why would they? They have olive oil. It seems to be something that everyone there has in spades. And I'll talk about the sort of Giza. This is an outlier, but you'll have to take my word for it. But we've written a paper with Karine Sawada, who's just up the road from you guys, a very famous Egyptologist, that shows that the Giza pottery is a kind of specialized production from the area of Byblos, but made specifically for an Egyptian market, which is why the chemistry is slightly different. Okay, what about the role of Egypt in international relations then, since we're talking about Egypt? I would say there's very little evidence, mostly at Byblos. We have, and it's mostly in the form of 25 vessels and about 40 of these flint knives. These knives are quite important, because they're, found in the ritual slaughter of cattle. You can see this on this glyph here. And they're sort of imported. So they're, in these finds, the bowls or whatever are mostly associated with the Baalat Gebel temple. So it shows that in the sort of Egyptian kind of interactions, that ritual is at the heart of exchange. They may be bringing cattle, they might be ritually slaughtering cattle, and you have these sacred bowls that are kind of usually associated with ritual, these stone bowls associated with ritual context. I'm told not exclusively, but in the main. And we know that the Egyptians take away comeware jars. They say they take away wooden resins. They probably do. They say they use cedar to transport the blocks for the pyramids. but it's not really clear what they're giving in exchange, because prestige durable goods aren't that common, really, on the Lebanese coast. So they may be giving skins or something that doesn't survive, but generally speaking, there's not a lot of evidence for Egyptian stuff. Whereas if you go to the Middle Bronze Age, there is quite a bit more. And just to show you the distribution here of the flint knives, generally speaking, if you have a temple with more knives, and you'll excuse this, I mean, it's done basically trying to reconstruct Danon's crazy excavation, but basically where you have more flint knives in a temple, you have them more distributed throughout the neighborhood. And the importance there is it shows there is a cohesion to our idea about neighborhoods. Okay. What about the early Bronze Age 4? Most sites are abandoned or the size is reduced. Comeware jars that are indicative of this system of agriculture or olive oil production disappear everywhere except for this Tel Arqa, where it carries on into the EB4. In Syria, things get much crazier. The Syrian tradition continues to flourish, but here in the Levant, central Levant and the southern Levant, we really see sites more or less either reduced in scale or abandoned. And pottery is no longer produced on a large scale. And the stuff that I've analyzed personally with the EB4 seems to be a complete technological break, with a lot more influence from Syria. And this could be interpreted as, people are moving more towards the Syrian sphere to kind of fill an ideological hole left by the collapse of the EB3 urban structure. So they need to get this from somewhere, and they're trying to find ways of being elite, and they're looking to Syria rather than to their own local elites. So these places, though, they might still be sacred and important, but are no longer monumentalized. And there's evidence for that. There's a site of Khirbet Zerikon where, where in the EB4, they're still putting metal objects into long abandoned temples. And at Farus even, they're coming back. It's clear there are no evidence of structures, but there are pits, and they're depositing mostly a lot of restorable pottery in these pits. So it's kind of evidence of feasting activity at the site. So, it's clear that even though the site isn't being monumentalized in the same way, that, essentially they're still coming back there. And here, just to show you what the pottery looks like, a lot more drinking vessels. And weirdly enough, even though there's a lot less of it around, it's much more varied in terms of the diversity, of the assemblage. And here, just to show you an image. Okay. So to sort of wrap up, I think I've spoken enough here. Let's just put the pieces together. There is a sudden adoption of elements of a new urban package, 3050 BC, on previously occupied sites, though there is no clear developmental trajectory from those sites to this. It seems to just kind of come out of nowhere. Lebanon has kind of small sites, with main buildings only occurring after 2900 BC, and then, a serious rebuilding after, 2800 BC in the EB3. It's worth saying that the EB3 is a period of decline further to the south in Palestine. So this really, the Lebanese coast becomes much more special, and the engagements with Egypt, at least at Byblos, seem to increase in this period. All the settlements are planned, but it's important to say that ritual and elite or administrative context seem to dominate sites. I mean, Farus tells a slightly different story, but generally speaking, there's a lot of temple for every building, so it doesn't really necessarily fit with our notion of civic activity. There's a great increase in pottery production to facilitate olive oil, and perhaps, although not much like not in the Iron Age, like where they have a lot of wine production. And there's an evidence of a move towards the local capture of that production during the EB3, which is very important because administratively things are getting more complicated and more controlled. Sites mediate the production and also the redistribution and also potentially the redistribution of these goods, it seems, and that seems to be their core function, based on the pottery repertoire. Mediate the production of olive oil and perhaps the redistribution or agricultural products in general. Also, I'm missing out the animal economy, but that's obviously a huge component of what's going on as well. There's little evidence for high status objects, and that fits with the early Bronze Age. It's Raffi Greenberg, who's a very famous archaeologist working on the time, calls this the culture of simplicity. He says it's kind of a rejection of what went on before in the sort of the Chalcolithic, where, there was a lot of showiness, there was a lot of working very hard to get prestige objects to take them away. This is kind of a form of devotion if you're coming to communal fields to work on agriculture, but you're doing so producing something more functional. But again, you're not really meant to stand out. There's not that much evidence until very late in the period for social differentiation. But again, then the whole thing seems to collapse. And so people were really probably very uncomfortable with that. External trade is limited. There's a lot of integration within sort of like, let's say, the Byblos region and the Arca region potentially, but there are a few key sites and temples that only are sort of facing outward, which is not the case in later period. And then there's a great decline at all sites and clearly a drastic economic shift. Like there is no more this communal system of agriculture that underpinned the system before seems to just disappear. Only in certain areas do we get it staying. So what can I say? And hopefully these are some conclusions to perhaps fuel an informed discussion. How do we explain the rapid adoption? I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I don't really understand why ideologically the idea that you should monumentalize and place make, or represent sites in different ways came into being. It might be a keeping up with the Joneses again. It's probably very likely, given that these people would have understood, they had been to Mesopotamia, they'd been to Uruk. Ideas are being moved between these areas quite a bit, and they sort of decided it wasn't good enough to just have a small structure or a hole in the ground. They wanted a temple for people to visit and venerate at, and they were able to. There was a time when you could convince people that this was a thing they should work towards, but that time is very limited. And actually, I think the main building periods at all these sites seem to be very limited in time, maybe 150 years or something like that. And that's where you get, and then eventually people just think, well, I don't want to do this anymore, and they move off into the hills or stop doing it. And so they just stop monumentalizing sites, which we may perceive as a sort of decline or a collapse at settlements. Given the size of cities and a clear focus on temples and a lack of evidence for markets or market exchange, should we rethink economic activity at these sites as really underpinning sort of ritual performance, feasting, and festivals? Other sort of social goods as well, but basically you've got essentially a lot of work being done to provision the temple, which then provisions greater activities within the society. We could, perhaps as an alternative to thinking of these as urban spaces in the way that we traditionally do, think of them more as temple complexes. That seems to be the way things are organized in Egypt at this time, and why not then at Byblos? And perhaps they should be thought about more like, I don't know, monasteries than cities. They're responsible for collective activity, gathering. They're places where people meet. The institution of the temple takes on a more organizational and administrative role, perhaps coordinating building projects and stockpiling supplies, which eventually goes into kingship. If I could just go back, I did want to say one last thing about Byblos. Our idea behind these neighborhoods is that actually we often think of these sites as being monolithic, like there's a king who controls them and everyone has the same identity. But actually, all of these different temples, it's entirely possible that they represent various social groups throughout the region, all working in harmony, all getting along, but effectively, building different temples that are meant to serve their specific communities, and then, so you can see in a way, the site is quite heterogeneous in terms of its structure, potentially speaking. There's no reason to think there was a top-down kind of strict hierarchy here. It's not like there's a big, great palace in the middle. So again, it reflects the heterogeneity outside. However, it's clear that some of these temples are much more important than others, and that might lead the development to kingship. Okay, the key takeaway here is that there are varied pathways and manifestations to complexity and various reasons underpinning it. The EB is linked by infrastructure because that's what people expect to see, and that's what they know. If you want to come to a temple in the EB3, you expect it to look a certain way, and therefore it has to follow some basic norms of the period. But the underlying idea and the underlying reason for that place being sacred, or the way in which veneration takes place, might be completely different. So some key questions that remain: where are the rest of the people? I mean, these sites aren't huge. Again, they could be living off in the hills, and then they come down when they need to. How well integrated are they with these fortified settlements? To what degrees do settlements control the surrounding landscape and the mountainous regions? We don't know. We've done a lot of survey now in the mountains. We find a few sites, but not a ton. There certainly aren't any big ones, but again, it's a very hard region to survey, and they may just not be visible. So again, how do upland regions factor in? Are these settlements, are they reliant for wood and materials in the upland region? Or are they just completely, not bothered about it? And basically this is a coastal phenomenon. Okay, I think that about does it for me. I just wanted to thank a number of people, here on the list here, the CBRL for funding a number of this, and of course, the many people who helped us along the way. Not just those in the audience, though they deserve a special thank you. All those who've worked at Kuba. I mean, the early pottery work was done with Mel Kennedy, and I credit a great amount of my development as an archaeologist to Herman, who has acted as a mentor for the majority of my career. However, if you think my ideas are crazy, it's my responsibility. Herman had no no responsibility, holds no responsibility for this. Okay, thank you very much.